Hi everyone, I'm Whitney. Welcome back to my channel. And welcome to my May wrap-up. This month was a little bit of a rough month for me. While I did get through 4 whole novels from my 22 books that I'm gonna read in 2022, because I figured I needed to get on that, every novel that I picked up seemed to be really complex and have deep, heavy themes. A lot of things were just like really long as far as page counts go. I don't know what I did this month, and I don't know why I did it to myself, but I do not recommend it. It was a really rough month. Let's get into some of these books that I finished in May. Some of these books that we're gonna start with are books that I just don't have a whole lot of awesome things to say. The first one is a really big surprise for me. It's Record of the Spaceborn Few by Becky Chambers. This is book number 3 in her Wayfarer series. I really enjoyed book number 2 of this series. It was a really awesome book, and I thought that the series was getting better and better. But then I picked this book up so I could get to book 4. I don't know what happened. Becky, girl, what happened with this? This book, I would love to tell you about what the plot was. I have no idea. We follow 2 characters, and you're just kind of seeing what happens as they're growing up on a spaceship in the future. There really isn't a big plot or events that happen. There's not really a climax. One of the characters is sort of murdered in the middle of the book, which might count as an event, but I don't really know what purpose their death played in this series. I don't really know. I gave this book 2 stars because I did finish it, but I really had to push myself to finish it. I would recommend that if you're interested in the Wayfarer series, I would skip this book. Another book that I really just didn't have a good time with this month, Shadow of the Torturer by Gene Wolfe. In case you didn't watch my 22 books for 2022 goal reads this year, I wanted to read this novel. This is a 4-book series. A lot of people tout this book as, and this series in general, as one of the greatest works of sci-fi fantasy of all time. It's supposed to be one of the defining sci-fi fantasy series out there. If you haven't already checked it out, Media Death Cult, the channel, really did this huge read-along review of these novels with a podcast group that also really likes these novels, so I wanted to check it out and find out what all the hype was about. I cannot rate this series. I didn't give it any stars because I had such a hard time with this novel. I apologize if I was just too stupid to understand what this series was about. I'm not really sure that I'm going to continue with it. I don't really know how I feel about it other than negatively. We follow a main character who is a torturer. That is his profession in the future. He has to go through training and learn to become a torturer. They are given people that they are supposed to torture by the government. Then he gets sent off into the world to give us a sample of the world. That was my basic understanding of the superficial plot without giving anything away. The interesting part is I understood at least the superficial plot up until the point of Thekla's story ending. If you've read this novel, then you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, then that means nothing to you, and I'm sorry. But there was a halfway point through this novel that I felt like I understood what was happening, and then all of a sudden he goes into the world on this mission, and I don't know. I don't know what's happening. I'm not really sure if I'm just not smart enough for this novel or what. That is the best summary I can give you, and yes, that's terrible. I'm so sorry. What I'm understanding about this whole series is that Gene Wolfe has an unreliable narrator, so a lot of the things that are unusual to us in our day and age are normal to the narrator. And because of this, he doesn't really notice or describe or tell you things that are unusual. You have to sort of pick up subtle clues and hints along the way. For example, there is a particular photograph that is explained and described in ridiculous detail in the novel. And what you're supposed to understand about this picture is that it is a picture of an astronaut in NASA today. However, it's so old and so decrepit, and he's making a lot of commentary about it, but he doesn't straight up tell you about it. There's also other characters who don't eat and don't sleep and have a lot of like lack of emotion, and you're supposed to get through those tiny subtle descriptions that this character is a robot or something. I don't know, I'm not gonna lie to you. I was not smart enough to sit down and dissect out each of the tiny subtle details of this series. I didn't really understand it. I did not have a good time with this series, and I'm sorry for those of you out there who loved it, but this was not my cup of tea. I do not think I will continue with this series because I felt like I didn't understand it at all. After that, I picked up a different novel. I wanted a standalone. I picked up Darwinia by Robert Wilson. This gentleman wrote the famous book Spin, which is a Hugo Award winner. I wanted to try this book out. I found it at the library at a half-price bookstore sale or something like that. The premise really intrigued me. This novel takes place in the 1800s, early 1900s, and is an alternate history of Europe disappearing overnight. And it doesn't really disappear in the sense that there's suddenly no longer anything there. There is one night that there's a glow. The characters call it a miracle. Everybody goes over to Europe to go check out and see what happened. We find plants and animals, forest and fauna that don't make any sense, that aren't something that we've ever seen on planet Earth. And what we sort of figure out is that this was an alternative evolutionary stage of Earth, and nobody knows how it happened, and there's a lot of mystery around it. We're following a character who takes an expedition with his team in the 1800s and early 1900s into what they are now calling Darwinia. On the surface, this story seems like an awesome exploration novel. On the back of the book, they sort of compare this to Jules Verne, Journey to the Center of the Earth, which all sounds really awesome and exciting. However, the name of the book and the back of the book sort of set us up for false expectations, because this novel isn't really about an exploration into what Europe could have been like. If you're looking for something like that, I would recommend you go check out Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky, but this book wasn't an evolutionary novel. It was really about the main character, Guilford, and what his place is in this universe and this world. It really took like a sort of a left-handed turn into what I was expecting the novel to be. I also felt like the author really just didn't have a good idea of where he was taking the story. We had several chapters at the beginning of the book that were from a character that he just sort of throws away like a quarter of the way through the book and never comes back. They never play a significant role in the entire plot. And then other characters come in that also were very not important to the story. There were some positives about it. It was a really interesting idea, and there were a lot of like short chapters which made it really easy to get through. I would probably have rated this series probably a 3-star, being a little bit generous, just because it definitely wasn't the 2-star of the record of the Spaceborn Few. It was a little bit more enjoyable than that. The next novel that I picked up this month, Song for Arbonne by Guy Gavriel Kay. I finally got around to reading something by Guy Gavriel Kay, which I had wanted to this year. I picked this particular novel up, which is a standalone fantasy novel that's an alternate history, because of the recommendation by a channel that I have started watching called The Library Ladder, which I have linked for you in the description below. Bridger from The Library Ladder has a whole video on all of Guy Gavriel Kay's novels and which ones he thinks are the best or not, and he recommended The Song for Arbonne as an unknown novel that he liked the most. So this is the one that I picked up, and it was a fun novel, but it was definitely very soft magic. This story is very much a medieval story with very small, subtle mix-ins with magic. The main plot of this novel focuses around 2 warring countries. Arbonne itself, who worships the goddess Radiance, is ruled by a queendom and really holds troubadours, poetry, and songs in really high esteem. And that's in direct contrast to its warring nation, Gorhat, who worships a war god, Koronos, and is ruled by a tyrannical king. This country really emphasizes that women should know their place, and does so with some very explicit scenes. We follow our main protagonist, Blaze, the mercenary soldier for hire, destined to end up in the middle of this conflict and have his grit and his loyalties tested. This novel is very much a slow burn and very focused on the world building. But if you're willing to get through it, there is everything a fantasy fan could want. Romance, political intrigue, fighting scenes, revenge, and redemption. Kay really does deliver everything that he promises in this novel, and it's a very satisfying ending that was worth the read. So this is definitely one that I really recommend. And next in this long saga of hefty lump books that I picked up was Words of Radiance, which is book number 2 in the Way of Kings series by Brandon Sanderson. This is also a book that I wanted to read on my books of 2022, so I was very proud to have read it. This book was a joy to read, maybe because of all of the other books that I have read this month, but it was one that I really just didn't have to think a whole lot about, and I already knew so much about the characters, so I got to follow along. Now, I don't want to give any spoilers away for this novel, and I'm sure that there are lots of booktube videos out there who have reviewed this series and this particular novel. We're following, particularly in this novel, Shalyn, who is one of the characters that I was really intrigued with from the first book, who did a lot of, I'm going to say she made a lot of mistakes in the first novel, and in this novel we get to really see her and her entire backstory and understand her reasoning for why she did what she did. It definitely advances the plot. We still get to pick up a lot of our other previous characters and find out what's happening with them. And this was an awesome follow-up to the Way of Kings novel. It's number 2, and I will definitely be picking up the rest of the series, maybe after a little bit of a break from this big month. But this was a book that I definitely gave 4.5 stars to. It wasn't quite perfect, but it was just a joy to read. So if you're a big Brandon Sanderson fan, it's definitely a novel that I would say solidifies the series as one of the better epic fantasy series out there. If you're an epic fantasy series fan, check this book out. The next novel that I read was Empire of the Vampire. This book was recommended to me by Mike's Book Reviews. Again, I will link his channel in the description below. This book is written by Jay Kristoff. I would probably compare this novel to the Witcher series from Netflix. If you've seen that series, you will probably like this novel. This novel follows one of the main characters who is an epic vampire hunter who gets captured by vampires and is now required to tell his story. This is, I think, the first 5 days of his story. You can kind of see where he is now versus where he started out, and we get to understand why his story is so important, how he encounters things like the Holy Grail, and how he becomes such an awesome vampire hunter in training. There's a lot to like in this story. We get to see a lot of action adventure. There's a lot of mystery and lure throughout this series, and it returns us back to vampires that are very dark and very scary and very, very malevolent. And that was what makes this story so fun. I would definitely recommend this series. I definitely gave it a 4-star. I will warn you though, this is quite a hefty lump of a book. It is a tome. It is like 800 pages, I think, and there's more to come. So it's definitely the first in a series and definitely a very adult, dark fantasy series. I also this month decided to go ahead and pick up a book called Too Like the Lightning by Ada Palmer. This is the first in a series of the Terra Ignota series, and I first heard about this series because it is up for nomination for the Hugo Awards for Best Series, and I hadn't really heard a whole lot about it. I heard it was a very hard sci-fi, so I wanted to check it out. Whew, I didn't know what I was getting into. I would probably tell everyone that if you want a trainer novel before you get into Shadows of the Torture by Gene Wolfe, I would probably recommend this series. This series is so thick and dense with all kinds of themes and all kinds of thoughts. It was a rough one. This one took me a lot longer to read than it should have, even though it was a shorter novel, because it was just so heavy. I don't know. I can tell you that we follow main character Mycroft, who is telling us the story of how the world got changed. And a lot of this hinges on one particular character who is a child named Bridger. Bridger has a power that nobody has ever heard of before, where when he touches inanimate objects, he can give them life or make them real. This is a dark problem because you can imagine that as a 2-year-old, he just randomly can give life to inanimate objects, including things like a plastic bottle that someone has convinced him is a cure to all ailments. And so when he gives it life and makes it real, it really can cure anything. But he also thinks that a rubber ball who is painted black is a black hole. And if he touches it and gives it life, it can really become a black hole and suck away the entire known galaxy. So this is not a great power for this child, and there's a lot of people who are around him who are trying to protect him from governments, anybody who's going to take advantage of his powers. They're trying to give him a childhood where he gets to choose what kind of person he wants to be and who he wants to help. But of course, they have to wait for him to grow up because of that. And Mycroft and these characters who are around him are really intriguing people. We get to know a lot about their background and a lot about who they are as people, especially Mycroft, who is the main character, and we discover that he is a serial murderer, which is one of the worst criminals of this entire society, and yet he has been rehabilitated into somebody who is sentenced into sort of like this weird slavery. And one of the things that he has to do is do this recording that we're reading about how the universe changed around this particular character. We don't get a whole lot of perspective from the character, the child Bridger, who was I think about 13 when this part of the novel was recorded. But we get a lot about what's going on around him and how there's a lot of political interplay in this. We also learn a whole lot about Mycroft as a character. There's a lot of like gender discussion sort of layering on top of this entire novel. There's so many themes that are going on in this book. It required me to go back and reread, and then I decided to go ahead and listen to the audiobook because I needed to re-listen to so many parts. This book was dense. It was really thick. If you want a trainer novel, definitely check this one out if you're interested in Gene Wolfe. But I will say that I was able to follow the plot. I was able to understand what was going on, and in that way I was able to enjoy it a lot more. So I went ahead and gave this book 4 stars. I also had to pick up something a little bit lighter afterward, so I picked up another 2022 goal, which was The Goblin Emperor. I was really happy I picked this one up because, in contrast, this was probably the most immature or the most YA novel that I read this month, which was probably really sorely needed. This novel follows our main character, who is a half-goblin who inherits the elven throne from his estranged dead father. His mother, who is a goblin princess, is already dead by the time the novel starts, and he is encountering quite a lot of resistance from the nobility on his rule, as well as surviving many assassination attempts and trying to get a handle on the day-to-day realities of ruling a kingdom. One of the things that really stood out to me about this novel is that it was a fantasy novel. There's almost no romance in this book. It is really an obvious discussion about discrimination based off of looks and skin color and whether somebody is beautiful or not. In that way, I really appreciated this book and its discussion, but it was very YA in that almost all of these problems were handled with rose-colored glasses. And by that I mean it was very obvious right and wrong choices. The reader didn't have to struggle with any kind of complexity or dilemmas in going through this novel because all of them were really obvious right and wrong. The main character didn't make a whole lot of mistakes, which also made it a lot more YA, a lot more younger, even though it dealt with some harder topics. There wasn't a whole lot of action in this book either, a few assassination attempts, but most of it was just dealing with sort of political interplay and how to rule a kingdom. If that's something that's interesting to you, definitely check that out. I know that this is the first in a series, so I think that there's a second and maybe even a third book if you're interested. The next, I think last novel that I picked up this month was something that gave me a lot more of a break also, and that is The Exiled Fleet, which is the second in the series to The Last Watch, which I think I read last month. I wanted something with characters that I already knew, kind of like the Brandon Sanderson novel, and I wanted to find out what happens. I would kind of consider this to be a sci-fi, space opera, popcorn novel, in that there's not a whole lot of subtlety, there wasn't a whole lot of really heavy thinking, there's not a whole lot of complicated science that happens in this book. It was just a straight good space adventure. We followed all of our main characters who are surviving at the edge of the universe as sentinels who are now trying to come inward into where society is to kind of give them warning on what's going on at the divide. We encounter some alien species in this book. We have a lot of answers that get revealed to us from the first novel. I don't want to get too deep into the plot of this one, but I will say that this duology was super fun. The author left the ending open, so I don't know if she's going to be planning to write a third novel or if we're done here. It was a great first duology for this author, and I think these are her first 2 novels ever written. I would recommend her, especially if you're just wanting some straight good fun and not a whole lot of thinking. That wraps up my May. I know, it's a lot of hefty lump books. Some of these tomes were just huge. There's a lot of dense, really intense themes here. I know that I need some recovery time after this month, and I would definitely recommend that you not do this the way that I did this month. I am really proud that I got through 4 whole novels of my goal 2022. I am really apologetic that I didn't have a lot of good things to say for some of the people that I thought I would love. Consider letting me know what you thought of these novels in the comments below. Be sure to like, and subscribe to my channel if you're interested in more content like this. Definitely see you in the next video.